Hi, I'm Andrew Rodriguez, and welcome to Psycho Bible, babbling about psychology and theology. In today's video, I want to present a multicultural defense of change-exploring therapy for same-sex attraction or gender identity confusion. Now, normally, when I address the attacks against the work we do, whether we're talking about SOCE, sexual orientation change efforts, or reparative therapy or reintegrative therapy, or safety, sexual attraction, fluidity, exploration, and therapy, all of which gets labeled as conversion therapy. I bring up two of the main accusations, or really myths, about the work we do. The harm myth and the ineffectiveness myth. That what we do is harmful and it's ineffective anyway. But once we address those myths, when all else fails, the opponents of change-allowing or change-exploring therapies engage in question begging. As the APA Task Force on Appropriate Therapeutic Responses to Sexual Orientation from 2009 states, quote, "Recent SOCE differ from those interventions explored in the early research studies. The recent non-religious interventions are based on the assumption that homosexuality and bisexuality are mental disorders or deficits, and are based on older, discredited psychoanalytic theories. None of these approaches are based on a credible scientific theory, as these ideas have been directly discredited through evidence or rendered obsolete." Unquote. The proof against these psychoanalytic theories is not presented, just assumed to be true. Whatever they have identified as the other theories are not even described, let alone refuted. The reality is the prejudice is actually against the individual with same-sex attraction that desires to explore his or her potential for sexuality growth and change. The APA has been stating emphatically that homosexuality or other forms of non-heterosexuality, let alone discordant gender identities, is a normal and good variant of human sexuality. But these are philosophical and religious assertions, not scientific conclusions that the APA is supposed to be qualified to make. And they are assumptions that are prejudiced against dissenting clients, especially adherents of the majority of world religions. Right off the bat, I need to explain something that goes against your grad school training if you're a therapist. The reality is no therapy or therapist is value neutral. Every psychotherapy theory includes a worldview being applied to the understanding of human nature, mental health, the etiology or causation of problems, and the path to resolution. This theoretical orientation and the personal worldview of the therapist determine what the therapist sees as relevant to address and how best to address it. Inevitably, there may be discordance between the therapist's and the client's values and perspectives. To ignore this reality leaves clients vulnerable to covert coercion or implicit bias. The solution is to disclose one's values where pertinent to the client's case. For example, in most therapists' informed consent, they share that confidentiality is limited to when the client presents as a threat to themselves or other people. We don't necessarily talk about it this way, but that is imposing a value, or at least disclosing a value. I had one client, for example, with chronic suicidal ideation, and also a conviction that at some point later in life, she is going to take her own life. And she resented that the majority, or really all, I would hope, of mental health professionals have a value to protect her from doing that. And she considered that a violation of her agency. She's like, that's my decision to take my own life is a value. And for you to try to intervene and stop me from taking my life is you imposing your value on me. So the reality is all therapists at some point may be imposing their values on clients by choosing to protect them from killing themselves. We don't seem to have a problem with that because the majority of us agree that we should do no harm and we should protect clients even from doing harm or violence to themselves, even if that is a violation of their values. So we disclose that. We inform clients of that when they enter into a therapeutic relationship with us, that there is a limit to me being value neutral in some way. Now, I'm not therefore advocating for imposing my worldview about sexuality on my clients, but I should at least know that my values are going to have a limit in how I will address the client's concerns or the topics they bring up for discussion. And so I should inform my client of my values, where it's pertinent. I don't need to tell them about what I think or how I have convictions about every topic out there, just the ones that are relevant to the client's case. This actually circumvents the possibility of covertly coercing the client, and instead opens up areas of difference for dialogue in the early days of treatment. This empowers the client to have truly informed consent. When therapists in graduate school are trained to be only affirmative of same-sex sexuality and also to present themselves as value neutral, they are actually left with two options that will hurt the client or the therapeutic process. Because inevitably there's going to be a conflict, or there might be a conflict, between being value neutral and being trained to be only affirming of LGBTQ or same-sex sexuality or gender, synthetic gender identities. One option is to openly practice gay-affirmative or LGBT-affirmative therapy, which, as we'll get into a little more detail later, outrightly entails rejecting value neutrality because of the urgency purported to be in getting the client to accept and adopt an LGBTQ plus identity and proceed through the coming out continuum. The other option is to start the therapy off presenting yourself as neutral on the topic of sexuality. And this may mirror the appropriate approach of providing space for the client to explore the topic without pressure. And this is probably very helpful for clients who are really more in the questioning phase. They don't really know where they land on how they want to address their sexuality or gender concerns. And so to just sort of provide a space for them to explore it without feeling like they need to please the therapist by landing on the therapist's worldview or anywhere other worldview can be helpful. However, once the client lands on a position and arrives at a goal, the therapist then discards the value neutrality. If the client decides to embrace homosexuality, the therapist takes on the gay-affirmative therapy approach. So they shed their value neutrality veneer, and they suddenly are endorsing the client's worldview. But if the client determines that he or she would like to reduce same-sex inclinations and explore his or her heterosexual potential, the therapist then becomes oppositional, either covertly or overtly. I can't tell you the number of clients I've had they started with me and they've shared with me how they've seen other therapists in the past who started off being neutral and just trying to be non-directive, not really sharing their viewpoint about sexuality. And the client was saying, I want to explore the root issues of my same-sex attraction or my gender identity confusion. And I want to get to the bottom of it. I want to resolve that. And I want to reduce them. And the therapist might have been neutral on that, just trying to help them adjust to, their living situation and just try to be more at ease, work on reducing their distress over their sexual feelings. But eventually, as the client persists in saying, no, I want help on actually exploring this more and changing it, the therapist would then ultimately break down and be like, you just need to accept that you're gay. And the relationship got very combative at some point, to the point where then it dissolved. I've had so many clients tell me this sort of story, where therapists start off being very kind, non-directive, very seeming like they're very open to exploration until ultimately the client's worldview clashed with the therapist's worldview. Well, they just wasted a whole bunch of therapy with that therapist, because if the therapist would have told them ultimately, hey, if you want to actually explore change in sexuality, I'm not the therapist for you. I disagree with doing that type of work, and I'm not open to exploring that. Let me give you a referral to a therapist who would be more competent in exploring that with you. So like I was saying earlier, LGBT-affirmative therapy is decidedly not value neutral. The protocol involves coercing the client to adopt a gay identity and go through what they call the coming out continuum. When I was in graduate school doing my multicultural counseling therapy class, we had to do a project where we watched a bunch of documentaries from the Alexander Street Press database. All different documentaries about multicultural counseling. And there's a series of documentaries by director Ronald Scott on psychotherapy with gay, lesbian, and bisexual clients. And so there's the series, part one was historical perspectives. So in that documentary, he presents Kathleen Mooney, a gay affirmative therapist. And she said, in normal therapy, we take a neutral stance, and the therapist's values and standards should not affect how we treat clients. But with sexual orientation, we must make an exception and affirm the same-sex attraction to combat the bigotry in the world, even if the client does not yet embrace a gay identity. Unquote. All right. She intentionally sets aside neutrality and works at getting the client to agree with her worldview regarding sexual orientation, regardless of whether or not the client agrees with her, whether or not they've adopted a gay identity. And then in Ronald Scott's second documentary in the series, Individual Assessment and Psychotherapy, they make clear that the stated goal of gay affirmative therapy is to move the client through the coming out continuum, starting with the client having awareness of their same-sex attraction, what they would call their sexual orientation, to then acceptance of the sexual orientation, to then integration of sexual orientation into all aspects of life, even to the point of the person becoming an activist. So they teach the client things like how to do their own hypothesis testing regarding stigma. For example, well, I think they grew up with some stigma that gay people are perverted and bad and like evil intrinsically. And so they'll do hypothesis testing like, well, do you know any gay people? Well, I know this guy who works at the grocery store and he's gay. Well, does he seem like a pervert to you? No. Okay, then therefore, that must be false. They do reality testing or cognitive challenging. So that's one of the steps in that going through that coming out continuum. And they say that moving through that process takes time, re-education, emotional processing, and acceptance. Re-education right there shows you they're re-indoctrinating or indoctrinating the client for the first time in pro-LGBT talking points. And if they're a religious client, pro-LGBT theology. And their hope is for the client to be open with different people in their life, ultimately to be open with all people, so they're public about their so-called sexual orientation. That's why it's a big deal for people in the gay world to have a coming out declaration, whether on social media or at a family gathering or among friends, and then to just be out and proud in the larger society. And so they acknowledge that someone can be at different stages of openness with the different people in their lives. Now, throughout the training, they refer to gay affirmative therapy, or now broaden it to just LGBTQ plus affirmative therapy. They simply call it affirmative therapy. But that's misleading. The definition speaks of affirming the individual, as if it is exclusive in doing so. Like any other therapy is not affirming the person as an individual. No, no, no. The reality is you are affirming a construct, the sexual orientation or gender identity construct about the individual. And so what they're doing is they're insinuating that the other approaches undermine the client's dignity. A more honest definition would be to specify that LGBTQ plus affirmative therapy is accepting, valuing, appreciating, and encouraging homosexual identity, behavior, and relationships, or transgender identification and expression, or non-binary, so some sort of synthetic sexual identity. And Kathleen Mooney's statements about intentionally removing neutrality really denotes the danger of gay affirmative therapy for the population that I would really like to focus on in this video. And that is, how do we address people who experience same-sex attraction who do not identify or self-label as LGB? If we were just may not address the T, but same for people who have some sort of gender-related distress, but they do not identify as trans or non-binary. What is the most multiculturally competent approach for them? So first, what is multicultural therapy? And I'm going to use the textbook that grad schools use to talk about this. Derald Wing Sue and David Sue's Counseling the Culturally Diverse. This book is where people get their indoctrination about microaggressions and sensitivity training and all sorts of your social justice talking points come straight from that book. So this is what I had to read in graduate school. Even when I went to a Christian graduate school, when I had to transfer out of Chestnut Hill and I went to Cairn University, this was still the text that they were using, surprisingly. Like, this just really shows how much we need a Christian, or just a non-woke, multicultural counseling textbook to replace this, because this is just where people get radicalized into gender theory and all sorts of critical theory and social justice activism. But as I'm going to demonstrate in this video, I can use this very same framework that the Sues offer in their textbook to provide an alternative to LGBTQ plus affirmative therapy. So first, what is multicultural therapy? One, it's a helping role and process in which the therapist has to play multiple roles. Okay, that's kind of broad, and we'll get into what those multiple roles are. It uses modalities and defines goals consistent with the life experiences and cultural values of clients. That's a very important point. 3, it recognizes all levels of a client's identity, their individual identity, their group or groups' identities, and universal identity, meaning their human identity. So make note here, people belong to multiple groups, and some groups have differing levels of salience to clients. For example, for some, it's more important that they are a male, that they're a man, than whether or not they're a black man or a Hispanic man. Their ethnicity is not as important as their experience as a male. So that may conflict with some people who use an intersectional matrix and say, no, your experience as a certain ethnicity is more important than your experience as your sex or your gender. So just one example. Or another example, more relevant to what we're talking about here, is there are individuals who may in some way belong to a group of sexual minorities, to use that term in the most broadest objective manner possible. They don't experience heterosexual attractions or inclinations. But they also belong to the group of their religion, their faith, such as Christianity. And in that group, acting on their non-heterosexual inclinations would go against their group's values. So there's a conflict between those two groups. But for the client, they're belonging to the group of Christianity is more salient to them than belonging to an LGBT group. So multiculturally sensitive therapy would recognize that and be sensitive to the salience of the group that the client most strongly identifies with. Next, multicultural therapy advocates the use of universal and culture-specific helping strategies and roles in the healing process. And finally, multicultural therapy balances the importance of individualism and collectivism in the assessment, diagnosis, and treatment of the client and client systems. Now make note here, gay affirmative therapy is emphasizing individualism over collectivism when a gay identity and lifestyle is in conflict with other group identities that may be more or equally salient to the client. Convincing the client to work on coming out is just as culturally inappropriate as advising an unacculturated Asian American client to learn to be more assertive and stand up to one's parents or separate from the family. So you could say that basically gay affirmative therapy is trying to coerce an individual to disidentify with one group and ally or conform to a different group. So really they're just trying to pull clients from one group to another. So according to Sue and Sue, what are the competencies needed to do multicultural therapy? First, become culturally aware of your own biases, values, and assumptions about human behavior with the intent of not imposing your own worldview upon culturally diverse clients. Note here how blatantly gay affirmative therapy imposes its values upon clients, all based on the assumption that sexual orientation is inborn and immutable, and that sexual liberation is a top priority value, or for gender identity issues, that their supposed gender identity is intrinsic to their core self, and thus may never be questioned or explored. Next, acquire knowledge about the worldviews of other groups. This should be a no-brainer. If I'm working with a client who's a Muslim, they're coming to see me for, say, sexuality issues, but I still want to understand their worldview and their values. Same as here if I've counseled like a Jehovah's Witness, for example. I'm still going to be curious, and I'm not going to assume they understand everything about Christianity the same way I do, because they have a totally different systematic. Even within Christianity, I deal with clients from various denominational backgrounds, so I can't assume that they're all coming to see me and they all share my appreciation for sacramental traditions and the gifts of the Spirit as a Pentecostal, and I have the same interpretation of different scriptures. No, I can't assume any of that. So I want to understand. That's just good counseling, is joining with the client at least to understand where they're coming from. The next competency is to acknowledge that people are all culturally diverse. And yes, that means that people who experience same-sex attraction or gender identity conflicts are also culturally diverse. Their ethnic or racial identities or religious identities may be in conflict with an LGBTQ plus identity. Gay affirmative or LGBTQ plus affirmative therapy treats the client's other identities only as obstacles to overcome in the journey to accepting a gay identity or trans identity. It treats ethnic or racial identity as less salient, and especially treats religion as disposable or modifiable, not taking into account that for people who are devout, orthodoxy and congruence with one's faith are tantamount. In one of the documentaries that I had to watch, Cure for Love from 2008, they criticize Christianity, though they attempt to specify evangelical Christianity as if there is a difference in the message of the gospel. Not just for its stance against homosexuality, but for the premise of the gospel itself, that all people are sinful and in need of a savior. Just the very idea that people have sins and that they have depravity was an offense to the people in that documentary. That general concept of Orthodox Christianity was attacked by the participants in the documentary that were dissatisfied with their religious background and how such a theology created guilt and shame to any degree. Their solution was to abandon Christianity altogether or to adopt a gay theology. So there's just evidence right there of how the LGBT activist therapist views conservative Christianity or just any traditional religion as an obstacle to overcome. That you have to either change the religion itself, which really is one of the recommendations from the APA's 2009 Task Force report. Well, there are more affirming streams or traditions in Christianity or different religions that the client can choose to go to instead. There's no recognition that for some clients, they want to stay within their more traditional conservative Christian tradition. No. If it conflicts with their sexuality, the sexuality should take precedence, and they should root their identity in that, prioritize that above everything else. In fact, what the multicultural therapy camp and even Sue do not acknowledge is that it is usually the religion most associated with an ethnic group that determines their cultural values. Like, in our secularized American culture or Western culture, we don't realize how much religion is at the core of a culture. So we just think that, well, if you don't like a certain tradition in your culture, just change your culture, leave your culture, or change your tradition, change your religion. They don't realize how really culture is pretty much all about religion. We're so secularized, we don't even realize that. In fact, the word culture comes from the root word cult, which means to worship. I know some of my etymologist friends might quibble over that, but the fact remains that at the core of culture is religion, our values about the transcendence of whether it's you believe in actual God or some other deities or some other values that transcend this earthly plane. There are values that then influence how you live, that are integrated into your culture. And those religious implications on sexuality may be so ingrained into the culture that they become less overt. So we don't really know anymore like why we care about marriage or about gender identity. We've divorced it, at least at a conscious level, from our religion. So we have sort of cultural Christianity in the majority of at least the Bible Belt. Most of America is now post-Christian, so we don't even have cultural Christianity anymore. But there are different subgroups and different cultures around the world that have different values, likely that started with a religious perspective, but maybe just became ingrained in the way they do things that people aren't even aware of how it's religious to begin with. So in Ronald Scott's third documentary, or the third part of his series, Psychotherapy with LGBT clients on diversity and multiple identities, they superficially or briefly review some of the different attitudes toward homosexuality among Latinos, African Americans, and Asians. So for Latinos, because of their strong religious devotion, usually Roman Catholic or Pentecostal, they are normally against homosexuality. But because of their even stronger devotion to family, they may usually move to silent acceptance and never speak about it, or use other rationale for why the gay family member is not in a straight relationship. They just won't talk about it plainly. In some Latino cultures, it is even acceptable to practice homosexuality even while in a heterosexual marriage and not identify as gay as long as one is in the dominant position in sex. So if you're a top versus a bottom, well, then you're not really gay then, because they only view it as gay if you're the submissive partner. So they might use some illogical rationale to justify and just give it some sort of accommodation. I think you see that more from those who practice more of a folk religion in their culture, not those who take their Catholic faith or Pentecostal Christianity very serious. For blacks, community is most salient, and the centers of their community traditionally has been the church, as well as the extended family, which all traditionally discourage homosexuality. Despite their style of Christianity emphasizing liberation theology and social justice, they still tend to uphold orthodox views on sexuality, which has been very frustrating to LGBTQ activists, since usually, obviously, LGBT activism is usually on the left, and the black community normally votes Democrat, and tend to be liberal in so many other areas, except for sexuality. So what I've noticed over the past 10 years or so has been a concerted effort in media, especially like television and movies, to try to persuade the black community to be more gay-friendly. We see that with the 2016 Oscar winner Moonlight, or the television show Empire, or there's so many others I can name, but you see that there's been an effort to kind of introduce some pro-LGBT messaging in media that really appeals to the black community. But I've also seen a pushback against that, because there are some who are vocal about showing how homosexuality is a bit of a threat to the survival of their race, and they want to maintain their racial identity, and they're starting to catch on that this pro-LGBT agenda is a covert attack against the propagation of their own racial identity. Now, Asian culture does not have a rich Christian heritage, at least not Eastern Asian. But the supreme value of Asian cultures is the family and its propagation, which does have some religious roots, such as ancestor worship. To shame the family is the worst thing one can do, and one area of shame would be to not produce one's own offspring, and therefore propagate the family name. For example, in Japan, it is acceptable to embrace homosexuality so long as one is still married and has children. For one's children to pursue exclusive homosexuality as well would cause great personal shame for the parents, as it is considered their job to train up their children to continue the family line. So we see here, even if you're just going to prioritize someone's ethnicity as a more salient group identity, then you have to acknowledge that certain ethnic groups do not align with pro-LGBT values. It's not just religion that conflicts with it, even though usually religion is at the root to that ethnic group not valuing LGBTQ. Anyway, back to the competencies needed for multicultural therapy. You need to develop appropriate and effective intervention and communication strategies in working with different cultures. That's all pretty obvious. You need to be able to communicate with whatever client you're working with. And that also means using language that can be received by the person you're speaking with. So, for example, if you're working with a Christian who has unwanted same-sex attraction, it would be culturally insensitive to say, oh, you're just gay. It's like, whoa, no. I experience same-sex attraction as an unwanted or uninvited, involuntary sexual arousal template. This does not determine my identity. And for you to keep referring to me as gay or as homosexual, if I'm not acting on it or I'm not adopting that identity personally, that would not be sensitive to my cultural values. So, something to keep in mind with that. Next, a multicultural therapy approach would advocate the use of indigenous methods of healing over just modifying a default psychological theory. This is a very interesting strategy or competency that Sue and Sue bring up. What has this particular culture used historically? Remember that counseling and helping and healing of the soul is not something new. There are native methods that may not be similar to modern psychotherapy, but they can be equally effective. At least we can explore the effectiveness of healing strategies in someone's culture that maybe haven't been tested out, like, say, cognitive behavioral therapy. So it's real interesting to me that Sue and Sue will advocate using indigenous methods of healing. Yet it's very hypocritical. If we are going to consider religion as a particular group or cultural identity, as one of the many types of group identities someone can have in their life, then we must be accepting of the indigenous methods Christianity uses for healing. Yet the psychological world, academia, and the media collude to disparage Christian ministries for the treatment of homosexuality and other sexual or gender issues, characterizing them as magical thinking, what they'll just call pray the gay away. So if you use prayer in your session, in particular a session in which you're helping someone with unwanted same-sex attraction, they'll say, oh, you're just praying the gay away. You're using magical thinking. They'll refer to what we do as pseudoscientific or quackery. So if, say, I'm using with a client Reiki healing or yoga, that's not pseudoscientific. I'm using an indigenous method of healing for that client, but once I use a method of healing that is indigenous to Christianity, the Christian culture, that's suddenly quackery or pseudoscientific. See the hypocrisy. Right now, all the rage is mindfulness-based practices and Reiki healing, and I'm all about mindfulness. But the world of psychology is only referring to mindfulness from Eastern mysticism, from non-Western traditions. There's a bias against Western, i.e. Christian, or at least Judeo-Christian, traditions. So all the appeal is everything that is not Western. So indigenous methods of healing that are from any other culture but a Christian culture. So clearly there's a bias in the field of psychology against a particular culture. And so that's an interesting segue to the final competency that Sue and Sue bring up. Understand your institutional or organizational system. Does it allow, enhance, or oppress cultural competence? The irony here is that as it stands, the Institute of Psychology is oppressive to individuals with same-sex attraction who belong to cultures that preclude an LGBTQ+ identity, invalidating their existence and punishing anyone that seeks to provide them services congruent to their cultural values. So to people from a group, whether a religious group or a particular ethnic group that does not affirm LGBTQ+, belong in the LGBTQ+ group? No. And so they go unrecognized. Not one video in that Alexander Street Press database that I had to use in that graduate school class acknowledged people with unwanted same-sex attraction or ex-gays as anything other than people in denial of their sexual orientation. And that is a huge injustice in our field. If we truly respect clients and their rights to hold differing worldviews, particularly in a pluralistic and multicultural society, then the ethical imperative is to allow the opportunity for therapists to openly practice within any of the cultural frameworks in any given society. We're a pluralistic society. We have multiple subcultures within the American culture. And so why can't there just simply be therapists who are open about practicing a therapy that is aligned with a particular subculture? That's why I have no shame in saying that I'm a Christian therapist. And I started Integrity Christian Counseling as my counseling practice. I am out there with how I am a Christian therapist. That means that the worldview that I bring to the counseling room is decidedly Christian. Now, because of my Christian worldview, I believe that free will is so important that you should not impose things on people, at least not to the point of imposing their decisions about things that aren't life-threatening. And so I also don't impose my values on my clients. I disclose them. So if we were to have a more open and honest psychological community field, it would enable clients to locate therapists that would best respect their own worldview, either because the therapist shares the client's worldview, at least to some extent, or because the therapist's worldview is one that would still respect the client's values even where they differ. Like I was saying, I offer my worldview as I disclose it to my clients, but I do not require that they agree with me on everything in order to do therapy with me. This approach honors the competencies that multicultural therapy purports to uphold, such as the following: using modalities and defining goals consistent with the life experiences and cultural values of clients. So, a client with same-sex attraction or gender identity discordance may have the life experience or cultural value that prioritizes gender identity based on biology and sexual relations based on the norm of heterosexuality and chastity. The multiculturally competent therapist will choose therapeutic strategies that honor these values. Next, recognizing client identities to include individual, group, and universal dimensions. If a client's motivation to explore sexuality change involves adherence to familial, ethnic group, and/or religious values, the therapist will not assume the client is merely internalizing stigma. The multiculturally competent therapist acknowledges that the longing to belong to and meet the standards of one's group are legitimate motivations. The therapist will not seek to turn the client against his or her family or religion if the therapist's values regarding sexuality differ from them. Next, advocating the use of universal and cultural-specific strategies and roles in the healing process. The multiculturally competent therapist will not disparage healing strategies that may be useful for exploring sexual attraction fluidity, labeling them as quackery. Given that one aspect of culture is religion, interventions unique to the client's religion, such as prayer and scripture reading, may be utilized alongside more universal and evidence-based strategies from mainstream psychotherapy. And finally, balancing the importance of individualism and collectivism in the assessment, diagnosis, and treatment of client and client systems. The multiculturally competent therapist sees the client as a member of a family and cultural system. The therapist recognizes the dilemma of the non-LGBT identified client with same-sex attraction or gender identity confusion or discordance in a society that encourages LGBTQ+ identification. The therapist may need to be involved in efforts to reduce societal pressure for individuals with any degree of same-sex attraction or gender atypicality to participate in the LGBTQ+ subculture. This is why I've made my videos on the Christian gender paradigm and dismantling the sexual orientation paradigm. Because we have now a ubiquitous message in our culture that is encouraging people to embrace LGBTQ, or at least to explore it in some way. And for clients who are conflicted about all this, they could really benefit from having the culture kind of tone down the messaging a bit so they're not as pressured to align with the culture or align with their church or their family, their ethnic group. They can make a decision that is a little more coming from the core of who they believe they are. Whether it means they go into LGBTQ or not, or they go explore an alternative pathway. My goal as a therapist is to help the client get to a place of freedom. I want to be able to afford them choice. This was like a eye-opening moment in therapy with one of my clients who is constantly distressed about his ongoing SSA and the pressures he feels between his desires and his family upbringing and his Catholic tradition that he comes from. So he's all got a lot of internal strife about this. And when I shared with him, if at the end of our counseling you decide to embrace a gay life, I would still consider that a job well done because you made that choice. Not under compulsion, but from a place of freedom. Now, and I was clear to him, now I would not approve of that. I would hope that you don't go that path, but I want to afford you the ability to make that choice for yourself. And he started to tear up because that's simply what he needed to hear. Now, the pro-LGBT therapists would say, oh, that second part where you told him that you wouldn't approve, that was shaming him. He did not experience that as shaming. He experienced that as liberating. Because he doesn't get that message from his dad, who freaks out at the very thought of his son having same-sex attraction. Just the very thought that his son might explore homosexuality to any degree freaks out his father. Like, he needs to know that there's someone who's going to still accept you, even if you're making a decision that I don't agree with. So that's why I'm involved in efforts to reduce societal pressure to make people conform to either the LGBTQ plus culture or to conform to a whitewashed type of Christianity. We do have a messaging in certain very fundamentalist forms of Christianity or other forms of traditional religions where it's not safe for someone struggling with their sexuality to open up to someone, because right away they're going to get a condemning message. I'm not about bringing that sort of culture back into their life and reinforce that. That's why so many of my videos are also about having a reduction of shame and increasing self-curiosity and self-compassion. So that's why I definitely am not side A or side B, nor am I that side Y, that mortification stream, or the condemnation stream. Because those reinforce a message that puts pressure on the client to not be honest about what they're dealing with, and it increases their shame and their anxiety, so they're not actually helping them get to the root issue. I want people to be able to explore this with the curiosity that's necessary to gain insight and healing. And you can't do that when there's these blaring messages from either the world or your family or the church telling you you've got to hurry up and conform one way or the other. People need to have a little bit of a break so that they can figure things out calmly. According to Sue and Sue, the authors of the main text used in graduate schools for multicultural counseling, each person is born into a cultural context of existing beliefs, values, rules, and practices. Their thesis is that counseling and psychotherapy have done great harm to culturally diverse groups by invalidating their life experiences, by defining their cultural values or differences as deviant and pathological, by denying them culturally appropriate care, and by imposing the values of a dominant culture upon them. Unquote. By this same standard, clients with same-sex attraction or gender identity conflicts that do not adhere to the prevailing LGBTQ plus ideology are experiencing oppression by the mental health field. And that needs to stop. When clients claim that they have experienced changes in their sexuality and the mental health field ignores them or asserts that their testimonies are false, the dominant culture is invalidating the life experiences of a marginalized group. Pro-LGBT therapists define clients' cultural values as deviant and pathological when they tell clients with unwanted same-sex attraction that they are merely internalizing homophobia or heterosexism or cis-heteronormativity, when they refuse to adopt an LGBTQ plus self-label and life. And denying clients access to SOCE or safety or SOCE therapy, change-allowing therapy, is denying them culturally appropriate care. The LGBTQ plus affirmation-only approach is imposing the values of the dominant culture, given how politically left-wing and pro-LGBTQ plus the mental health field is, upon a minority culture. Every time there's a ban on so-called conversion therapy, that's the dominant culture punching down on dissidents of the LGBTQ dogma of our society. This is all a socio-political act, according to Sue and Sue, just not the way that they probably envision. So, what is the most multiculturally competent approach to people with same-sex attraction or gender identity discordance? Well, the Alliance for Therapeutic Choice and Scientific Integrity has developed and offered up their own practice guidelines for the treatment of unwanted same-sex attractions and behavior, which can also be applied to treating gender identity conflicts. So I'm going to borrow from some of their guidelines along with my own observations and an integration of the multicultural counseling doctrine. Before approaching this issue, one must recognize the complexity and limitations in understanding the etiology of same-sex attractions and gender identity conflicts. Although there is now a growing consensus among researchers that the causation is multifactorial and that research is inconclusive in delineating a single causative pathway, the rest of the world, academia, clinicians, media, church, general public, still holds to simplistic views of homosexuality. Even the reasons why someone would experience SSA as unwanted are multifactorial, not just internalized homophobia and not just religious conviction. More on this in a bit. So next, clinicians need to be aware of their own values, attitudes, knowledge or lack thereof, and biases regarding homosexuality and how they affect assessment and treatment for those who are open to or embracing a gay identity, questioning, or those with unwanted same-sex attractions. Kathleen Mooney's example certainly demonstrates evidence to me of the myth of being value neutral. We all have values and they will affect how we view and engage clients and the issues they present, including the ways we choose not to engage them. Therefore, I believe best practice is to disclose values when our values may be unduly swaying the client to a position not previously held, or when our desire to be flexible and value neutral is prohibiting the client from moving ahead with a treatment strategy. So if I'm just trying to be value neutral and being non-directive, but the client is looking for my active help in exploring change in their sexuality, that's a conflict of values right there. Clients need to be making informed decisions about how to proceed, not just with treatment goals, but with a specific clinician. If your therapist shares that they're not even open to exploring change and helping you dig a little deeper to root issues and use their training for how to resolve those issues, that's information you need to determine if you even want to continue with this therapist. When we have identified and established our position on this issue, we are vulnerable to our bias manifesting in the following ways. So for the gay affirmative therapist, or the secretly gay affirmative therapist who's trying to present as value neutral, that bias may manifest in emphasizing similarities in functioning between homosexuals and heterosexuals, ignoring the higher incidence of maladaptive childhood experiences or aversive childhood experiences and other associated pathologies, and the greater use of mental health services among the LGBTQ+ community. They may emphasize the lack of research showing efficacy of change-oriented therapy, even though there is currently disagreement about how to measure sexual orientation, as well as they're ignoring the fact that there's not much research on gay affirmative therapy and its effectiveness or necessity. They may emphasize the potential for harm in change-oriented therapy, primarily based on the idea of immutability or the likelihood the client will not achieve the degree of change that they desire. And so we consider that a harm if they don't reach their goals. That's not necessarily a harm if they don't reach the degree of change that they hope to meet. So the gay affirmative therapist may overemphasize how painful that will be and that they want to avoid that at all costs by just encouraging the client to accept a gay or LGBTQ+ identity. The LGBT+ affirmative therapist will likely emphasize internalized homophobia as the only reason that the client may want to pursue change, minimizing their sincerely held religious beliefs or other perfectly fine, justifiable reasons for wanting to explore reducing same-sex attraction or same-sex inclinations and gender conflicts and explore their heterosexual potential. And of course, I'll readily admit that change-oriented therapists or more traditional therapists are vulnerable to biases, such as emphasizing the pathologies related to homosexuality or particular homosexual lifestyles or sexual lifestyles. Even though the same-sex attraction may not be pathological itself, may not be an actual diagnosis, but there are certainly related pathologies that the bias may emerge by overemphasizing those other pathologies like depression, substance abuse, or promiscuity. The change-allowing or change-exploring therapist may overemphasize the likelihood of change or some sort of formula for change. Or they may minimize internalized homophobia and societal pressure. An ethical change-allowing therapist will acknowledge that, yes, there could be internalized stigma that the client has, and that could be part of their motivation for pursuing change. Perfectly understandable. But we don't use a simplistic or reductionistic approach to say that's the only reason that the client may be pursuing change. And the change-allowing therapist may too easily assume that the client's desire to change is because they just want to be congruent with their values. Like I said, there could be multiple reasons why the client is looking into therapy. It could be that they want to live more congruently with their values and they want to explore their heterosexual potential. But maybe to some degree, if not entirely, it could be that they're ashamed of themselves and they're ashamed of rejection by their family. So we see both camps have potential biases against referring out, including referring to a needed support group or maybe a different community, as sometimes it would be better for the client to explore a lifestyle or a different pathway for a while to experience for themselves, if that really is what they want. Next guideline, respect the value of the client's religious faith and refrain from making disparaging assumptions about their motivations for pursuing change-allowing or change-exploring interventions or refusal to adopt a gay identity. Studies have shown that mental health clinicians are less religious in beliefs and practice than the general population. So your typical therapist is not going to appreciate the importance of especially a conservative religious orientation that the client may have. So an ethical therapist will be seeking to actually understand that better and to honor the client's religious convictions and traditions. In one documentary making an attempt to critique change-oriented therapies, therapist Eli Coleman offered several concerns, one of which was the danger of the client's choice to change being due to societal, familial, or religious pressure, arguing that we really should make sure that they are truly making decisions for themselves about who they are and not trying to become something that others want them to be. And I largely agree with that. Of course, he's assuming that it's only in situations where the client's looking to reduce SSA that they're doing that out of societal or familial pressure. Yet, we're now in a culture that is so inundated with pro-LGBTQ messaging that I am encountering some clients who are feeling pressure to explore or adopt a gay identity, and they're conflicted about that. But anyway, his argument appears to be from a very Western, individualistic approach that diminishes the collectivistic nature not only of certain ethnicities, but also of certain religions. Multicultural therapy attempts to associate Christianity with Westernism. And sure, this is true, but we must also remember that Christianity has its roots in Middle Eastern culture. And though Americanized or Westernized Christianity leans more toward individualism, Orthodox Christianity will always have collectivism integral to its nature. As Jonathan Haidt often points out, religion binds and blinds. It brings people together and it blinds us to maybe some discrepancies in doing that. That might be a bit of a negative way of putting it, but the main point is that religion brings cohesion to a group. It brings us together, binds us. A devout believer will hold their allegiance to biblical doctrine and God's will to a higher place of importance than self-gratification, even sexual gratification. Furthermore, at a human, universal level, one can arrive at a personal conviction that homosexuality does not fit one's design independent of religion or overt societal pressure. It's usually an assumption that, it's because of the religious convictions that they're exploring change. But I've had clients who aren't particularly religious, and they don't come from traditional religious homes, but they just have a core sense that homosexuality is not authentic to who they really are, or simply they realize this is not natural for just humanity. To this, gay-affirmative therapists would argue that the individual is falling victim to the pervasiveness of heterosexism or cis heteronormativity. But the reality is that heterosexuality is the norm on a historical, biological, and universal level. To some extent, it is reasonable for the client to feel different or even abnormal due to an orientation so divergent from the norms of human nature. So when you have that felt sense that there's something off about the way I feel toward members of my own sex, that I'm lacking interest in the opposite sex, you don't really need a religion to notice that and to be motivated then to explore change in that area. The challenge we face is how can we affirm the individual and reduce shame and combat stigma without affirming desires and behavior that the client sincerely holds to be false, unhealthy, or sinful. Isn't this really the task of all mental health practitioners? We work to reduce stigma without normalizing what has become maladaptive to the client. This does not repathologize same-sex attraction, but it does acknowledge how the conflict between desires and values can be maladaptive. Which side should win this battle, the desires or the values, is determined by one's biases. And herein lies the importance of the next guideline. Respect the client's dignity and right to self-determination. Here's where we balance the cultural value of collectivism with individuality. The choice of how to proceed with addressing the unwanted same-sex attractions and behavior should be determined by the client, not the therapist or the psychological powers that be. Therefore, it is not only important for the therapist to be aware of his or her own biases and cultural influences, but it is paramount to fully explore with the client his or her own history, values, desires, beliefs, and reasons for pursuing one route or the other. Lastly, there's the principle of advocacy. At this point, we may have the need to advocate for the client. No matter which direction the client chooses, they ought to have their dignity upheld and personal rights protected. Unfortunately, over the past couple decades, we have seen a disproportionate amount of advocacy for LGBTQ plus identifying clients, while individuals with SSA who refuse to identify as LGBT, or people with gender dysphoria who refuse to transition to trans or non-binary, increasingly go unrecognized and invalidated, and have their rights, particularly for the treatment of their choice, violated. And that is not respecting their culture. So I hope I've adequately demonstrated how we can use the same model, the same framework, same terminology that the multicultural movement in psychotherapy uses to justify allowing for and protecting, even promoting, therapy to explore change in unwanted same-sex attractions and gender identity conflicts. So there's some ammunition for you all. So if I gave you something to think about, please leave a comment, share, subscribe, hit a like button. I really appreciate it. Until next time, please know that Jesus loves you freely, fully, faithfully, and fruitfully. Take care.